Hello, I'm Samuel McVicker, and welcome back to another episode of What Just Happened. So, last week we saw an attack in the capital city of Mali, Bamako. The attack took place on the 25th of April, and our Middle East and Africa desk has been keeping a close watch on it, writing reports, hosting webinars. So, joining me to walk us through this attack and where we're at now is Mr. Edward Bach. Ed, thanks for joining me.
Thank you for having me, Sam.
So, for those who may not have been following, let's just start with the initial attack itself, the attack on the capital city. What did we see on the 25th of April, and how did these attacks unfold?
Sure, Sam. So we saw, coordinated attacks by the Al-Qaeda affiliated JNIM group, but we also saw them conduct attacks in Bamako, as you say, a lot of southern cities in Mali, but we also saw JNIM conduct a joint operation with the Tuareg Assawad Liberation Front, or FLA rebels, who then seized territory, including the city of Kidal in northern Mali, and they sort of have held this territory in northern Mali, whereas the attacks in Bamako and in southern cities were more sort of immediate hit and run attacks.
Yeah, so right off the bat, can we just take a minute and talk about who the players are here? So you mentioned the Al-Qaeda affiliates known as JNIM. We've got the Tuareg folks. Is that it?
Those are the two main groups who are involved in these attacks. There's also in southern Mali, Islamic State Sahel Province, ISSP, who weren't involved in the attacks but are trying to capitalize on the instability to broaden their range of operations in Mali. But the main players here are, as you say, JNIM, who have been conducting attacks routinely across Mali for the last couple of years. But also they have regional chapters in other neighboring countries. So they got a large swathe of the territory they control in Burkina Faso, as well as in southern Niger. And they've also conducted attacks in northern Benin as well. So they are a real regional group.
Yeah, understood. Okay, so your reporting has suggested that Bamako is kind of more insulated from this sort of attack as compared to the rest of the country. How does this attack change that perception, and does it?
So Bamako is insulated in the sense that this was the first attack in Bamako since September 2024. But Bamako hasn't been totally insulated by the effects of the insurgency. So we saw in September last year, JNIM launched a fuel blockade campaign where they successfully attacked several overland convoys transporting fuel into the capital, Bamako, from neighboring countries. And that campaign drove real shortages of fuel in Bamako. It led to the imposition of fuel and electricity rationing measures, led to the closure of several businesses. So while there hadn't been attacks in Bamako since 2024, and in that sense, it has been to a degree insulated, it has been feeling the impacts of this nationwide insurgency that JNIM have been waging.
So alongside the attack on the capital, you mentioned this earlier, there were sort of simultaneously other attacks occurring throughout the country. Does this tell us what does this tell us about, how effective and the operational status, I guess, of JNIM and the other groups right now?
So we already know that JNIM are a highly sophisticated group, and they've proven this with the success of the fuel blockade, as well as other attacks across Mali. So it does speak to how developed the group are, but also sort of underscores the failures within the Malian security apparatus and their intelligence services to not sort of detect this big military buildup and that this attack was coming. I think what it also speaks to as well, and this is particularly true of the attacks in the north and the collaboration with the FLA, we've seen previously a degree of tacit collaboration between JNIM and the FLA. But this degree of close operational collaboration to then conduct such a sophisticated and an elaborate attack is a real new development. And it'll be incredibly interesting to see, and something we'll monitor closely in the coming weeks and months, over how that campaign in the north progresses and whether that evolves into the FLA attempting or establishing a de facto governing administration in northern Mali.
Yeah, and I'm glad you brought up the north. I'm going to ask you about the north in just a second. Here's a couple of quick ones. Just I didn't put them in my notes, but the FLA, That's a new player. Who are those folks, and how are they different from JNIM? Would you say?
So the FLA are Tuareg rebels sort of seeking the establishment of a state of Azawad. So their gripe with the Malian state is different to JNIM, whereas JNIM does not hold claims over any sort of territory. It wants the dismantling of the Malian regime and ultimately the imposition of a new regime that is seen as more sort of malleable and compliant with JNIM's radical Islamist philosophy. So the FLA and the Tuareg group are really seeking to establish their own governing entity in northern Mali. And that's sort of where the key difference between them is, in the sense that JNIM aren't necessarily looking to govern territory. They're more looking for a regime that will allow them to conduct their activities sort of uninhibited.
Let's move on to this blockade. So you've mentioned there's been successful blockades in the past, but there is another sort of similar situation unfolding. So your reporting notes closures of roads outside the city of Bamako, disrupting movement. How severe is this blockade, and could it signal a more sustained blockade, or is this going to be something that just fizzles out? Would you say?
I think it will be fairly sustained. So we have seen already that JNIM have established roadblocks on key transit routes leading into the city, all the key highways leading into Bamako. Now, there are some reports that they're letting individual vehicles transit out of the city, but that is sort of on a case-by-case basis and can change very quickly. I think the key thing here is they're not really letting any goods come into the city. Now, the Mali military have been able to secure some limited deliveries of convoys going through, but that is only under really heavy military escort. So that takes considerable resources for the Malian military to escort, a small convoy through into the city. But, those are limited deliveries. And I think more broadly, what we're going to see is that the conditions are going to deteriorate in the city in the coming weeks. We're likely to see shortages of fuel in particular, but also of general goods, of food. And JNIM are ultimately going to intensify this siege to really try and put pressure on the regime and the junta to try and induce its collapse ultimately as the conditions continue to deteriorate in Bamako.
Thanks, Ed. Okay, so let's talk about the north. So for laymen like me, can you I think the webinar spent quite a bit of time on the north. Can you briefly just explain why the north region of Mali is so important, and to what extent groups like the FLA, JNIM are expanding their sort of footprint there?
So the reason the north is so important, particularly to the junta, is it's not as economically active and doesn't contribute as much to Mali's economy, although there are some important gold mining assets there. But the reason that the north, and in particular the fall of Kidal, is so important to the junta is that fairly shortly after the junta came to power, they recaptured Kidal in 2023 with the help of what was then Wagner Group, but more broadly Russian security assistance. Now, that was a huge propaganda win for the junta, as the city had been under rebel control for several years, and it vindicated the junta's strategy that they were correct to expel French military assistance and side with what was then the Wagner Group. So to then lose Kidal 3 years later is incredibly damaging to the junta's image, and it ultimately was an integral part of the justification for their leadership. And with that now undermined, it really raises questions of, the longevity of the regime and whether it's ultimately being effective in achieving its aims.
So let's talk about the regime a little more. Let's look more closely at what's going on with them. So what's the current security situation for the regime and the folks who make up the regime, or the junta, as you've called it? And how is this affecting the perception of their stability?
So the junta at the moment is highly insecure. As I say, that narrative that they had stabilized the security environment that was such a big justification for their rule is totally undermined. I think that it's increasingly likely now, particularly as conditions likely deteriorate in Bamako in the coming weeks, that we see some sort of coup to remove Goita from power, and maybe we see other elements of the Malian military take over. I think that's an increasingly likely proposition. But, any new military government that did replace Goita and came to the helm would be confronted with the same issues. And ultimately, the instability that would come from any removal of Goita from power would likely only compound issues of sort of the coherence and the effective decision making within the regime. Within the military. So ultimately, it's only going to worsen the problem. And we're likely to see the junta stay increasingly unstable in the coming weeks and months.
And so in the last just 24 hours, President Goita has declared himself defense minister as well. What does that mean? And what does that mean for the stability of the regime and the coming days and weeks of the conflict, would you say?
I think it's well, firstly, we should reference that the previous defense minister, Sadio Kamara, was killed in the initial round of JNIM attacks. So there has been this vacuum over the last week and a half or so. And that vacuum has probably undermined the military's capacity to respond to these attacks and sort of formulate a coherent response. Now, the fact that Goita has taken on the defense minister post for himself and has sort of merged that with the presidency, I think it speaks to ultimately his anxiety about elevating another figure within the military that could then be an alternate source of authority who could then, in a couple of weeks, possibly challenge Goita's leadership. So I think it shows that the fears of a coup or some sort of challenge to Goita are not just something that we're looking at and analysing from the outside, but I think it shows that Goita himself is particularly concerned and preoccupied with that.
Yeah. So, okay. So unstable regime, insecure leader seeming to consolidate power by just making himself in charge of everything. And it seems like it only gets worse. There's been some scrutiny of the external support, particularly the Africa Corps, which haven't performed well militarily, I gather. How important are these sort of external allies to the regime at this stage? Pretty crucial, I imagine.
I would say so, yes. The Africa Corps, certainly. I think it's worth sort of referencing that until June last year, it was the Wagner forces or the Wagner group who were Mali's primary security force assistance partner. Now, in June last year, they were replaced by the Africa Corps, and that slightly changed the mandate of the Russian security assistance, sort of away from one that had been a real operational, hands-on combat role into one that is now more explicitly focused on regime protection. So I think that's what you could, to that extent, ultimately, the Africa Corps have kept Goita in power in spite of the blockade, in spite of the attack. But I think the Africa Corps are really what is keeping Goita in power at the moment. I think if you then zoom out and look at what that means for the credibility of Russian security assistance across the region, Russia has sort of also tried to expand security assistance into neighboring Burkina Faso and Niger. Ultimately, this is going to undermine the credibility of Africa Corps' capacity to conduct counterinsurgency operations. I think particularly amid reports that the Africa Corps did a negotiated withdrawal from towns in northern Mali has fueled a sense of betrayal amongst some elements of the Malian military. And I think it's now fair to say that they are increasingly integral in keeping Goita in power.
And so who's in the Africa Corps? It's not still Russians just rebranded, right?
I think that is increasingly hard to discern. I think there's a very strong chance that a lot of the rank and file members of the Africa Corps are leftover Wagner Group forces who were then made to sign new contracts that sort of officially brought them under the Russian military intelligence umbrella. In terms of the higher ups and the sort of commanders in charge, that's harder to say whether they've come from directly the Russian military or whether they're, again, still leftover Wagner Group forces who have then been co-opted into the Africa Corps. But they are broadly, they are Russian security, sort of state security forces, for want of a better word. And I think there is a decent chance that a lot of them are leftover Wagner Group forces.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Okay, let's back up again and look at the regional outlook for the coming days and weeks. So how do these developments, these recent attacks, fit into the broader trajectory of insurgency terrorism, non-state actor violence, whatever, across Mali and the wider Sahel region?
I'd say these attacks are really significant. We have seen insurgent groups across the region be in the ascendancy, conducting frequent attacks, now sort of controlling vast waves of territory as well in across the Sahel. But I think what's really significant here is if the success of these attacks emboldens other regional chapters of JNIM and other insurgency groups across the region to try and then conduct similar attacks, to not just sort of conduct hit and run and ambush attacks on security force positions, but actually try and attack big cities, large towns, and attempts to really increase pressure on regional governments to force their collapse and ultimately produce security vacuums across the region that they can then inhabit and engage in their activities. So I think it is a really critical moment across the whole region.
And overall, would you say this is militant groups gaining momentum, or is it kind of a flash in the pan, so to speak?
I think it is militant groups gaining momentum. I think particularly the situation in northern Mali is not going to be one that is going to be addressed in the short term. I think it's quite hard to envisage, particularly amid the constraints within the Malian military, that they'd be able to militarily dislodge groups from the north and sort of reassert state control there. Now, outside of the north, it's harder to say, but I do think we've seen across the region that states have not been able to formulate an effective security policy to reverse the gains that are being made by jihadist groups across the region. And there are sort of a multitude of factors behind that, but I think one that's key to flag is that ultimately these free junta governments in the Sahel are not cooperating with the coastal West African states, and that vacuum that is being led by several former initiatives that used to be in place is ultimately an integral factor in allowing these armed groups to spread across the region.
Could you say why that cooperation is breaking down?
So before the three coups in Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, there were several regional joint security frameworks that all the coastal West African states in ECOWAS, so the Economic Community of West African States, were a part of with these free states. Then following the wave of coups from 2021 to 2023, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger all left ECOWAS and they formed their own alliance of the Sahelian states, AES. And those three have been, have sort of decisively turned away from the coastal West African states and from ECOWAS and have been going about by themselves and left, several joint security frameworks. Now, the vacuum that's been left by those frameworks that has not really been adequately replaced is, I would say, an integral driver of allowing these groups to conduct more attacks, expand territory, and ultimately contribute to the deteriorating security picture across the region we're seeing now.
So looking ahead, what is your desk keeping an eye on or watching for in the coming weeks and months that might indicate whether this situation is stabilizing or it's set to deteriorate much further? So
in Mali, I would say the two things that we're going to be watching very closely. So the first one is the conditions in Bamako and how effective this JNIM blockade is. As I said, as conditions deteriorate in Bamako, as we expect them to do so, that does increase the likelihood of a coup to remove Goita and sort of facilitate a period of protracted instability that's only going to exacerbate the constraints that the Malian military already faces. So that would be the first one. And then the second one in Mali would be whether there are further withdrawals by Malian forces and African Corps forces from northern towns, and whether we see de facto split in Mali become formalized. So I think those would be the main two that I would highlight.
Well, thank you very much, Ed, for coming back. We'll be keeping an eye on this, and if it gets any worse, I'm sure we'll drag you back in here. But until then, thank you to our listeners for joining. Please join our podcast mailing list where you can get the most recent episodes from all of our shows straight to your inbox. No spam, no junk, nothing like that. Again, thank you to Ed, and until next time, have a great day.